Hello everyone. Today I want to talk to you about the Tapping Reeve and Litchfield Law School located in Litchfield, Connecticut, and hopefully convince you to visit if you ever find yourself in the area. Litchfield is a peaceful and beautiful town, known for its preservation of historical landmarks and buildings. Residents of the town have a strong appreciation for their history, which dates back to colonial times. Out of all the historical spots of interest you might see upon visiting Litchfield, which include a number of beautifully preserved 18th and 19th century homes, the Tapping Reeve House and Law School is perhaps the most well-known and significant. Countless American men owe their beginnings in law and government to Tapping Reeve and his Litchfield Law School, and I look forward to sharing with you in this video some of the stories of the most prominent individuals. The exact number of men who graduated from Tapping Reeve during its 60 years of operation, who later went on to serve in federal and state government positions, is honestly hard to believe. Here are the highlights. 2 vice presidents, 28 U.S. senators, 101 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, 6 members of the cabinet, 3 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, 13 chief justices of state Supreme Courts, and 14 state governors all owe their beginnings to Tapping Reeve. Beyond these office holders, numerous other graduates went on to establish their own law schools or become law professors. And outside of the law or government, others became successful in a wide variety of other career fields. In sum, it would not be an exaggeration to say that Tapping Reeve and his law school helped raise a second generation of American leaders who are more than able to carry on the mantle passed down to them by our founding fathers. So you're probably asking, who exactly was Tapping Reeve? Born in 1744 in Long Island, New York, and a graduate of Princeton University, Reeve eventually moved to Litchfield, Connecticut after studying law under Judge Jesse Root in the state capital of Hartford. In the early 1770s, Reeve established a private law practice, and by 1773 he formed his own law school inside his Litchfield home. This was significant because at the time there was no other school like it anywhere in the United States. While many students studied law at schools associated with universities, William and Mary was one of the first universities to offer this in 1779, or more often privately through apprenticeships, the Litchfield Law School formed by Reeve was the first institution to be dedicated exclusively to the study of the law. Reeve's very first student was his brother-in-law, someone you're probably quite familiar with, Aaron Burr. Burr, of course, would, among other things, go on to be Vice President of the United States and to infamously kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel. The other famous graduate to later become Vice President was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun's education at Tapping Reeve might surprise you, given he lived and grew up in South Carolina. What this demonstrates, though, is the national reputation that this small school achieved in a relatively short period of time. Students who wanted to pursue a career in law wanted to attend the Tapping Reeve Law School and were willing to travel across the country to do so. Roughly 300 students, about 30% of the total enrollments in the school's 60-year history, were from states other than Connecticut. Given the constraints of travel and movement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this is an astonishing number. After graduating from the Litchfield Law School, Calhoun continued to be an advocate for the education he received there by writing letters of introduction to Tapping Reeve on behalf of students who were interested in attending. Calhoun was always appreciative of the instruction he received from Tapping Reeve, and there's no doubt that it had a major impact on his success over his storied 40-year career as a politician and statesman. The high demand for Reeve's services as a law professor meant that after a few years of running his school out of his home, he needed another building. In 1784, he built what is now the Litchfield Law School, thinking he could now expand operations to about a dozen students or so. While the building itself never was expanded upon, eventually enrollment would grow to over 50 students at its height. In the late 1790s, Reeve's time serving as judge on the Connecticut Superior Court meant that he could no longer fulfill his responsibilities as the sole tutor of the law school. As a result, Reeve hired James Gold, a former student, to serve as a fellow professor. By 1814, Reeve had risen to Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, the highest court in the state. With this role now his priority, he spent less and less time at the law school until he retired officially from all professional duties in 1820. With Reeve's death 3 years later, the school began to decline under Gould's leadership until it closed for good in 1833. By this time, more and more universities were founding their law schools, which was able to compete successfully with Tapping Reeve for enrollments. Now, I should return to say something about Tapping Reeve's teaching style, which helped to make his school unique and immensely successful. As I touched on earlier, apprenticeship under an established lawyer was the most common form of legal training during this time period. This apprenticeship usually lasted 3 years before students were ready to take the bar examination. Reeve had a much different approach to legal training. His methodology emphasized lecturing his students on a variety of topics associated with common law cases, along with performance-based mock trials. Moreover, Reeve also encouraged his students to make use of his law library to further enrich their knowledge of various cases and legal principles. Rather than the 3 years most law apprentices needed before they were ready to practice law on their own, Reeve students usually graduated in under 18 months, no doubt in large part because of his engaging teaching style and the camaraderie he shared with them. It should be noted that the stellar reputation earned in this era of American history by Tapping Reeve and his law school was enhanced by many other attempts by prominent individuals to start their own law programs, the majority of which ended in abject failure. A few are worth mentioning, if only to illuminate Reeve's accomplishment. James Wilson, a signer of the Constitution and an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, attempted to start his own law program in 1790 through what is now the University of Pennsylvania. Even with a national spotlight and the support of President George Washington, Wilson's lectures and teaching style were considered dull and of little use to students of the law. 1 year later, he stopped delivering his lectures entirely. The same situation occurred at around the same time with the legal scholar James Kent and his program at Columbia College. Initial popularity in Kent's lectures dissipated and all but disappeared just a few years later. The law school at William and Mary, one of the first to be associated with a university or college, did have some success with a limited number of students, but the time its enrollees needed to devote to the program before they were ready to practice law was double that of those students at the Litchfield Law School. And perhaps finally, Harvard established a law school in 1817 and did experience some initial success, but for a number of reasons, including the lack of a brilliant professor like Reeve, enrollment declined dramatically by 1829. All of this demonstrates that Tapping Reeve's accomplishments should not go understated. His law school was a landmark achievement, not only the first of its kind, but one that could not be easily duplicated. So what does the modern history of the Tapping Reeve House and Law School look like? Let's discuss. In the early part of the 20th century, the Litchfield Historical Society took action to refurbish and preserve both historical buildings. After obtaining ownership of the Tapping Reeve House in 1929, the Historical Society was able to acquire the law school, which had been previously moved across the town to serve as an addition on a house. A ceremony was then held to commemorate the return of the law school to its former location, next to the Tapping Reeve House. More than 30 years later, in the 1960s, both buildings would be designated as National Historic Landmarks and added to the National Register of Historic Places. In the modern era, the Litchfield Historical Society, along with numerous other historical sites within the town, has ensured that the buildings are properly maintained and preserved. Today, most importantly, visitors to Tapping Reeve can see the small law school exactly as it existed in the early 19th century. More than just a museum, visitors are able to participate in a number of interactive activities which allow participants to discuss major local, state, and national issues from the early 19th century, and even to vote on them. Guests to the law school, and to the small interior lecture hall more specifically, will be able to see firsthand how Reeve's teaching methods were employed to transform how the law was taught to students. Visitors of all ages can also engage in role-playing activities by dressing up in period-era clothes and engage in buying and selling goods, utilizing knowledge from colonial and early American Litchfield. Serving as an orientation of sorts, a welcome video is also offered to all people visiting the Tapping Reeve House, where one can learn about the lives of the nearly 1,000 students who attended the law school. Upon visiting the Tapping Reeve House and Law School, history professor Catherine Hermes of Central Connecticut State University put it best when she said, quote, "If you want an experience that alters your perception of what a museum is like, humanizes the past, engages every member of your family, contributes to historical debate on an intelligent level, and offers a critical look at America's early republic, come to Litchfield. I hope that when you get the chance, you'll visit the Tapping Reeve House in Litchfield Law School. Come experience all that beautiful Litchfield, Connecticut has to offer, and you won't be disappointed. If you'd like to learn more about Tapping Reeve, his law school, and the history of Litchfield, I encourage you to visit the official website for the Litchfield Historical Society, the link to which I'll put right at the end of this video. Thanks so much for listening.